welcome to today's migration policy seminar. Those in the room and those joining us online, you're very welcome. Today, very happy to welcome Louis Volante, who's a distinguished professor at Brock University and a professorial fellow at UNU Merit, the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance. So works on global governance of education, education politics, and large-scale reforms of education systems. So Louis is very welcome. Today he's going to be talking about how international large-scale assessments, particularly the Programme International Student Assessment, PISA, shapes global education governance agendas. So for those in the room and also those online, you're very welcome to join the conversation. For those online, we would ask that you put your comments into the chat box and we can address them that way. So without further ado, very happy to hand over to Louis.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining online and for those of you here today in person. Just very quickly, if you haven't heard of Brock University, I won't hold that against you. It's a medium-sized university close to Niagara Falls. So it's in the area which is considered a pretty nice part of the province. It's on a UNESCO biosphere, and the whole campus is surrounded by vineyards. So it's a pretty part of Ontario. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is actually a collection of 2.5 papers, 2 that are under review and 1 that we're currently working on. And I know ahead of time I was asked, could I provide the papers? I would ask, you can email me and I will send you a copy, but they are under review. So it's kind of like a weird sort of situation when you have papers under review, whether you should share them publicly. It's in an intermediary stage sort of thing. But what I'm going to be talking about today is some work that I've done with colleagues in different parts of the world. The first part of the presentation was largely done with a professor at the University of Milan, Paola Mattia, and Don Klinger, who's essentially the vice provost at University of Murdoch in Australia. And the second paper is a paper I wrote with Christophe de Witt, who's at KU Leuven, and Jose Pena, who's at Bocconi University, also in Milan. So it's a nice collection of academics. What I think is also nice about the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today, it's quite interdisciplinary. So we have Paola's in political science, Christophe is an economist, Don is a measurement and evaluation sort of scholar. So it's quite interdisciplinary. So, I'm going to go through some of these slides very quickly, and you'll know right away that I don't read anything. They're there for you, but I won't be reading them to you. And I'll just emphasize a few key points for you. So the first thing is that when we think about students in general, and immigrant students as well, they often get discussed, particularly when we're thinking about international large-scale assessment measures. This concept of human capital always comes up. And in fact, don't do it now, but if you were to Google the Human Capital Index, you would have a ranking of countries based on how well they do in terms of educational outcomes and a number of other things. So of course, education is really important, and how well students do on these international metrics features prominently in these measures of human capital, okay? Oh, and I guess the last point I want to mention is also in terms of immigrant students, one of the things that they do with the data is they also look at the relative distribution of scores for immigrant students based on how long they've been in the country, whether they're first or second generation, and also their socioeconomic status. So that is achievement. This is actual completion. So when we think of educational effectiveness, we tend to think of it in two broad concepts. One is how well do students achieve, and also not only are they achieving well, but actually are they completing school on time? Are they moving on to post-secondary? Are they moving on to vocational education? If I click on that link, which I won't because it'll take me out of the presentation mode, it gives you an actual rolling map, and I can share these slides with Andrew, or I actually have them so you can have a copy of them. You click on that link, you can actually click on different countries, and it'll give you a nice sort of color scheme for how well students are doing. I've done some analysis as well in terms of just school completion. So, I mean, I won't go through it all, but very quickly, as an example, in Canada, if we were to raise the graduation rate of our students by just 1 percentage point, from essentially 87 to 88%, we would save about $7.7 billion a year. Okay, so when I do international work with policymakers, obviously they are very keen on, what are the economic implications of doing better in schools in terms of achievement and school completion. Off the bat, a student who finishes secondary versus non-secondary completion is about 25% in income. And there are two main sources to use to come up with this number, which are direct costs and indirect costs. So as an example, an immigrant student from a lower socioeconomic background who doesn't graduate from high school also tends to have poorer health outcomes. And that's an indirect cost, right? Particularly if you live in a country with publicly funded Medicare systems. So when I talk about IOs, the four biggest ones, and I mean, there's really three big ones, which are UNESCO, the World Bank, and OECD, but I also put the European Union in there because the European Union, which where we are right now, often looks at international measures and uses that data to provide specific CSRs, country-specific recommendations. Okay, and it's all fully available on the European Commission's website, including a couple of books that I recently published with the European Union. They're fully available in open access as well, which deals with some of this data, and it's showing differences across the European Union. But you've heard of UNESCO, and I'm pretty sure you've heard of the OECD. The World Bank tends to be more active in the global south as opposed to the global north. And that is one of the themes that I want to impart on you today, is that these IOs really were conceived in the 60s during a time, and they had a mandate to work in particular parts of the world. So the OECD traditionally has been emphasizing educational outcomes in the industrialized world, okay? But I'm going to show you Pisa in a sec, but we've gone from like 30 countries to 80 countries, including many in Southeast Asia and Africa. In the next iteration, you're going to see such a wide swath of countries being compared against one another with vastly different economic and cultural context to them. UNESCO, very quickly, primarily involved in the global south, has tended to focus on completion rates as less so achievement, but we'll get to that point around achievement versus completion rates, which I emphasize at the very beginning. The World Bank, I'm sure some of you have heard of Education for All, which was a very large policy initiative that tried to guarantee primary school educational attendance as well as secondary school educational attendance and gender parity, because in the global south there are significant differences in the attendance rates of girls versus boys. And in fact, we have metrics around things like gender equality for around the world, looking at what percentage of students are able to attend school at certain levels within the system. If you don't have a background in education, it's fine. But when they say primary education, they're essentially talking about kids that are in grades 1 to 6, so up to 12 years of age. Secondary education, if you're from North America, you automatically think of high school starting in grade 9, but UNESCO's classification system is the one that's used globally in terms of grade levels. So 1 to 6 is primary, 7 to 11, 12 is secondary, just so you know. I already mentioned the issue around CSRs for the European Union, but one point I want to make clear is when it comes to immigrant students in particular, the European Commission actually produces reports which shows how well immigrant students are doing relative to their native population for, and they disaggregate that further for first and second generation immigrant students. And if you email me, I can even send you a couple of papers I've published in this area, which gives you a nice sort of cross-sectional look at these differences. But the point that I do want to emphasize with the European Union, they often use, and this is something that's shared amongst all the European Union's member states, is they often have a minimal benchmark for what their students should get at in terms of the OECD PISA program. So they don't want anything more than 15% of their student population to fall below that minimal threshold. And I'll explain what the threshold is because there's levels of achievement. But everyone is hoping to have less than 15%, and no one has less than 15%. So by their own internal standards, none of the 27 member states are actually hitting that minimal standard. So more than 15% of all 27 countries have more than 15% of their students below the minimal proficiency standards. I'm going to focus primarily on PISA, but just so you're aware, the PIAC, the third bullet, is actually PISA, but for adults, and it looks at 16 to 65-year-olds. I've done some work with John Jerram at University College London, where I was actually a visiting prof as well. And we've done some work looking at this relationship between PIAC performance and social and educational outcomes. So this data set is used quite broadly across different disciplines. And so if you're interested in adults, then I would suggest you take a look at the PIAC data. Okay. Resilience, which is probably one of the key themes within this research, is this notion that students achieve well despite coming from a lower socioeconomic background. Now, everyone in the room went through the pandemic. And when you say to the average person on the bus or, at a cafe, what do you think of when you hear the word resilience? They often think of this ability of bouncing back, of being tough, of being able to, get through a difficult time in their life. That's not what it means in educational circles, though. In educational circles, it has, and the OECD and PISA has really come to dominate this notion of what resilience means. It really means is what percentage of your student population is getting level 3 or higher on the PISA assessment. Okay, and there's 7 levels: 1B, 1A, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 is the highest level. Level 3 is considered the minimal proficiency level to have reading and numeracy skills that you can function as an adult. Okay, so anything below that would be considered you're going to have difficulty in society. So there's metrics across all countries. What percentage of your students are below level 3? Going back to my earlier point around CSRs as an example, what percentage are below that? The European Union would like no more than 15% to be at level 2 or lower. Almost all countries are level 3, are above that 15% range. I think I mentioned to you already that it's a test that's expanded. It was around in 2000. It's done every 3 years. So 2003, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, not 21, 22, because there was a year of delay for the pandemic.
By OECD.
By the OECD, yeah. And so the 2025 test is taking place as we speak right now. Those results will be released in December 5th or 6th of the following year. And they always come out usually the 5th or the 6th the following year. And we're going to look at that data. How am I doing for time? I'm doing okay for time, for a change. I want to get to the interesting part, which is how you can use this data to actually look at outcomes for students. So it's hard to see, but what you want to have is top right, which is high achievement, and greater socioeconomic fairness. What you don't want to have is bottom left, because bottom left means lower achievement, which is 300 a score. For instance, Panama is 360, and you have, let's go with, let me find Italy. Italy is almost at 475, okay? Which Italy's right here, okay? So on average, 15% of a score can be predicted by socioeconomic status. We collect that. They collect that with their ESCS, their Economic, Social, and Cultural Status Index. These are questions that go to the student, they fill it out, and they use that as a broad measure to try to capture SES. It's not perfect, but it's widely accepted in the field. So once again, top right is high achievement and low equity. Obviously, we ideally would like 0% of a student's score predicted by socioeconomic status, because what that tells us is a student who comes from a very wealthy family or a student who comes from a very poor family are both achieving on equal levels, okay? Not at the individual level, but at the aggregate group level, okay? And so, of course, when you have a country like Romania, more than 25% of the student score is predicted by socioeconomic status. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what's the difference between, say, a score of 500 and a score of 520? Normally, from 2000 to 2018, around 30 points was the equivalent of one grade level, okay? So if this individual is from England and he has a score of 520, and this individual is from Poland and she's got a score of 500, that would mean that the average English student is performing one grade level above the average Polish student, based on the 2018 to 2022 results, okay? It used to be on average 30, but because of the pandemic, the standard deviation has shrunk. So when we think about impact, we often think about grade levels. So 20 points, one grade, 10 points, half a grade level. You don't want to have a student in a country which is 2-3 grade levels below the average student in another country, right? It's a sign that your education system is weaker. However, here's a key point to consider though. How fair do you think it might be to compare a student from Hong Kong to a student from Panama? Vastly different cultural context, vastly different economic and social support systems that are likely to be in place. And yet, these are the measures that are being used to make large-scale cross-national and national policy decisions. I mentioned the CSR, so I wanted to give you a visual so you can see what it looks like. So you have Ireland, Ireland and Estonia are just below the threshold based on 2018 and 2022. And then you have Bulgaria, 53% of students from Bulgaria are not meeting the threshold. But the important thing to understand is if you take a look at the difference between blue and orange, what you're seeing is everyone tends to be doing worse, and because of the pandemic. And I'm going to show you what the specific impact of the pandemic has been. And keep in mind, PISA's with 15-year-old students. So if there's a significant drop like this, it's very difficult to make it up once the student finishes secondary schooling because they're 15 years old. And so that's another thing when we think about the impact specifically on vulnerable student populations, low SES and immigrant students. Younger immigrant students actually tend to be more resilient than older immigrant students because of, the late arrival penalty, and I'll get into that in a sec. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. Anyways, I wanted to show you, here are some differences across the 27 member states. Turkey was the only one that actually improved during the pandemic. By the way, they had 0 lockdowns, which some people think is quite noteworthy, that there were 0 lockdowns. Countries with the longest lockdowns, this is just Europe, but I mean, Canada as an example tended to have poor outcomes. So this relationship between school closures and achievement outcomes and what that lasting impact looks like is important to consider. So, the theme of the talk is around governance agendas, this concept of soft law, right? I don't know if you've studied it have they covered soft law in the program at all? No? So soft law is the opposite of what you would think of as a legally binding sort of law. So it's this idea of, if the European Union as a group, as an example, decides, well, we don't want no more than 15% of our students to be below this target, we want to take active steps so that they can improve. It's not legally binding, but you're compelled to do so because you're part of this transnational organization or part of this global organization. By the way, all the OECD countries have a representative on the governing board. The only exception is Brazil. I have no idea why, but that's a separate topic. You can click on these links later when you get access to the slides. But if you were to look at the actual level of depth that has been developed, like for instance, each one of these, for instance, PISA and Focus, is a very quick policy brief. And I'm sure if you were to go there, just type in immigrant, you'd get at least 10, probably more specific policy briefs designed focusing just on immigrant students and giving you what are some key takeaways from a cross-national perspective in terms of policies. So what we did, Christophe and Jose and myself, is when we were thinking about the impact of the pandemic, we thought, okay, well, it's probably inappropriate to just look at 2018 versus 2022. So last year, not this January, previous January, the results of PISA 2022 were released in December 6th. In January, we took all the micro data and we started putting it into a large data set file so that we could do some analysis of the data. We used OLS, which is a regression analysis. And what we did is we wanted to control for trend because there's countries that are going down and countries going up. And so we did that by inputting data over the last 6 iterations so that we could isolate control for trend, control for gender, control for immigrant status, and control for socioeconomic status to isolate the impact of the pandemic just on students. And what we're doing right now is doing further analysis just on the immigrant data, Jose and myself. I won't go through the formula, but I just want to mention a couple of things. We control for number of weeks of school closure and school spending, in addition to the 3 that I just mentioned, which are almost always used in cross-national comparisons, which is SES, gender, and migrant status. Now, you are in MPC. I think it's important, and I've mentioned this in a previous talk, Andrew was there, that one of the challenges with looking at this data for immigrant students in particular is we can only know if they're first or second generation immigrants. We don't have any way of knowing around circular patterns of migration, which is very, very important because you can have a student coming into the system and out of the system at multiple points. So that is one of the challenges with using this data set to make broad assertions around immigrant students. But in general, what did our overall results show? Students lost 70% of a school year, which can't be accounted for by trend. Now, that is significant, especially in mathematics, because once again, this is a 15-year-old student. You can't make up 70% of a school year in grade, let's say grade 11 and grade 12, if I use a North American sort of. So the point is that if you were to probably talk to professors in undergraduate programs that have to teach any kind of program that has mathematics, they'll be telling you the same thing. There's significant gaps in students' learning. In terms of what these scores look like in terms of grade level differences, I wanted to show you some results. So for instance, in Iceland, Norway, Finland, and Slovenia, it's 1.5 school years they've lost, So during a 1-year lockdown, they lost 1.5 years of schooling. It's quite remarkable. And so these are unprecedented. We've never seen anything even remotely close to this. In fact, when you factor in the grade level equivalent. If a country grows down 8 scale points, that's a quarter of a grade. We have countries going down 15 points in one cycle, controlled for trend. So these are quite remarkable. And then in terms of the economic output, the World Bank has estimated it's about $975 per student in a low or middle income country. Okay, so these are staggering kinds of results. They have direct implications for dealing with students, immigrant students. I wanted to show you the COVID coefficients to show you essentially the lower the number, the more impact the pandemic had on students. So you take a country like HRV, is that Croatia? Help me out. HRV, I think. I always get messed up with, I think it's Croatia. Yeah, so they had low and Malta's low, Turkey plus. So you have Slovenia, Norway, Israel, Finland, all with very, very pronounced impacts on students based on the pandemic. And here you have the quartile scores. So quartile means socioeconomic status. So the pinkish one means 0 to 25%. These are the poor students, okay? And then the second quartile is 26th to 50th percentile. Third is the blue, which is 50 to 75. And the fourth is purple, which is 75 to 100. We usually do a comparison between the top quartile and the bottom quartile. The bigger the difference, the more inequity you have in the system. We're running this with immigrant students as well. And over and above the 70% that I just discussed for immigrant students, even when you control for socioeconomic status, what we're finding, and it's being replicated in national literature as well, it's another 25%. So we've always been aware of not trying to conflate immigrants with SES because obviously one group, especially first-generation immigrants, tend to achieve more poorly than second-generation immigrants, and it's largely tied to language issues and socioeconomic status. So, you know, obviously what you're seeing in Europe is more encouraging than what you're seeing in New Zealand as an example, right? Or Canada as well. You're seeing some pretty clear separation in terms of quartiles. Ideally, more bunched up, more equal. Here's boys versus girls. And so like in Australia for math, as an example, you have a complete separation between boys and girls, which shows that what you're seeing in this slide is that the pandemic was significantly more pronounced for girls versus boys, which goes counter to the global literature. We tend to think of boys as a more at-risk student population. But this is showing us quite clearly that's not the case. Time-wise, I'm doing good, 10 minutes. So I've talked about achievement, but I want to talk about the non-cognitive issues as well, which is, you know, the things that we think of in terms of soft skills, social emotional learning, growth mindset, sense of belonging to schools as an example, and bullying, you know, like immigrant students in general for the last 20 years, the data is quite clear. Not even OECD data, there's other data as well. It all says the same thing. For instance, immigrant students are 3 times more likely to be bullied in schools than non-immigrant students. That in turn feeds into a lower sense of belonging. Globally, all students' sense of belonging is going down. Globally, also the relationship between where students go to school and their zip code or their postal code is becoming less and less correlated. There's less and less of an association. And that is even more pronounced in schools that in countries that have high school choice. So I'll use Sweden as an example. Sweden started to introduce school choice initiatives, private schooling, et cetera, et cetera. Sense of belonging has gone down significantly. And all these sort of non-cognitive issues, students are suffering as a result. So going back to my earlier point about resilience, so the average person, right? When they think of resilience, they tend to think of it in non-cognitive terms, right? Mental health. I feel happy. I feel connected to the school that I go to. I feel I have self-efficacy. Growth mindset, if you've never heard of the concept, the simplest way I could explain it is we have two people here. One person agrees with the statement, I'm not good at math, but if I try hard, I'll be successful. That person has growth mindset, as opposed to another person saying, I'm not a math person, so it doesn't matter how much I try, I'm not going to be successful. That's a fixed mindset. So obviously we want students to have a growth mindset. You try hard, you put the effort, you will be successful. In earlier literature, we've referred to resilience as grit, not resilience. We called it grit. But what you're seeing is sense of belonging is going down, fixed mindset is going up. That's bad. Bullying went down 3% during the pandemic. Now, I have time. It went up for girls, it went down for boys. Does anyone want to take a guess at why it would have gone down for boys and up for girls? And I'll give you a hint. Schools were locked down. What type of bullying are we talking about? There's two overall branches of bullying. Physical bullying. Yeah. So the hypothesis that we have, and we have to confirm it, and we can't exactly confirm it, but it has been replicated in smaller studies, is we do know that girls tend to bully more online than they do physically, and boys tend to be more involved in physical bullying. So when you take a look at the actual data, by the way, the further right for growth mindset is bad. This needs fixed. So USA actually did better and Canada did worse for growth mindset, more of a fixed mindset. And then sense of belonging, the further left you go, bad. Further right is better. So blue bands show less sense of belonging in the USA, as opposed to in Europe, sense of belonging went up. And then bullying, obviously, it's all on the negative. We want to go more to the right, more to the right. But, when it comes to something like bullying, as an example, when you disaggregate this further, students that are bullied in terms of achievement, but also in terms of school level, grade level differences, it's 2 years. So you can cut this data multiple ways to show that there is a compounded impact for cognitive and non-cognitive when you put them together. What we're doing right now, Jose, is we're looking at this in addition to SES, but then slicing the migrant stuff up even further. But you get a sense of what's taking place here. Ultimately, what we're seeing here is the impact of the pandemic has been quite negative in terms of academic and non-academic outcomes, cognitive and non-cognitive. It hasn't been shared equally. It's been shouldered primarily by girls, more so than boys, primarily by low SES versus high SES, and primarily by immigrant populations as opposed to non-immigrant populations. We still have to actually run the analysis to look at the difference between first and second generation immigrants, because what we're showing you here is just looking at SES quartiles without the immigrant data shown. And so when we think of policies that will actually support immigrant and low SES students, these are the ones that are repeatedly made. We've found in the literature. I should also mention I have a book coming out. It's published by Routledge Press. The nice thing is that I had funding for open access. So it's going to be an open access book. Everyone can get it. It's free of charge. And we've compared all G10 countries in relation to some of the stuff that I've already shared with you. But I guess the thing that I want to mention to you in terms of immigrant students is, all of these things, what we're talking about, early tracking, by the way, is this idea of streaming students into lower ability tracks. So tracking within an education system could be within the school or across schools. So for instance, if you live in Italy, you might go to Liceo, right? So it's a school track that's designed to take you to university for university attendance. For immigrant students, what we found is that immigrant students that arrive in a country after the age of 12 tend to suffer a late arrival penalty. You've probably heard this before, right? However, that also interacts with when streaming might take place, okay? And so I did a previous volume for Springer looking just at immigrant students in relation to these policies, and this late arrival penalty fluctuates. So in Ireland, for instance, that late arrival penalty seems to kick in at 12 years of age as opposed to 12. 12 is sort of the global benchmark across most countries. So I think if you think about these policies in relation to specific countries, you can see how certain countries are more immigrant friendly and less immigrant friendly, and that shows up in their achievement outcomes. I'll give Canada a little bit of a plug, although it's not entirely because of our education system, but Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has an immigrant performance advantage, not disadvantage, meaning our immigrant students outperform non-immigrant peers, which is quite unusual. I think the closest country to achieving that in the European Union or in Europe in general would actually be the UK. It's quite close. The results are almost indistinguishable. Immigrant students are slightly below, like 5% below, but it's not statistically significant. I think I'll stop there because I want to take some questions.
Thank you, Lou. So we've got time for questions now, those in the room, those online. Very happy now to open the discussion. So anybody like to kick us off? Please, could you introduce yourself as well, so for those online?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Tihina Chatterjee. I'm a policy leader fellow here. I am from Canada, Ontario, so I quite understand rock. I was happy to see some of the results. We're doing well, but maybe I'll take a bit of advantage to understand a layer deeper. In your studies, did you put into socio-economic consideration, like immigrant families who are below a certain income threshold? Did you have a chance to look at that? And then secondly, I can share from the time when COVID had hit, and I was at a service delivery agency for immigrant settlement in Toronto. We saw the lack of laptops being a big challenge. I mean, it sounds trivial, but it was one laptop in a house, and they had to run like school classes online. Parents had to do work, and that did impact the ability of student performance. But this is just from my observation standpoint. But did you see any technology hindrance in your research that did come about? I was curious.
There's a lot of research out there looking at the impact of the pandemic tied to things, not just hardware, but also Wi-Fi connectivity issues. Those were pretty pronounced around the world. Obviously, poor students had more pronounced problems when it comes to things like that. But let me answer your first question, though. The first question is, did I look at SES? I'm still reliant on the ESCS index measure. But what I can say is our sample is 1.45 million students over 6 iterations. So I think we have pretty good confidence in saying that the statistics that I reported, they're pretty strong. They're pretty valid because we have a large sample size. Now, the issue is, does the ESCS actually capture socioeconomic status accurately? And that's, people have debated that for years. All of these measures that come along with any kind of test, even in a country like Italy, you have Invalsi tests that students write, and they have surveys that go out to students and they fill them out. And, you have to make a determination on, okay, so this person, parent has this education level. I'm going to make an assumption based on SES based on that, plus a bunch of other questions, right? But John, Jerem, and I, we did look at this because we were using PIAC data as well. And I think it's fair to say that when it comes to parental education, it's not a perfect measure, but that with the other questions that are asked does capture SES fairly accurately. You know, it's the best of what we have.
Thank you. Could I ask? Well, I've got three, so I'll put them quite quickly, Luke. First of all, why these international organizations, so World Bank, OECD, EU, and UNESCO? I also thought maybe UNICEF might be relevant as an international organization. And when you talked about their strategies, I was kind of interested in the effect of these strategies. PISA seems to be very effective. The EU talked about research and communication. So what do we know about the effect? That links to a second point, because I'm currently coordinating a project funded by the EU on research policy relations. And the general consensus is in the area of migration research, that research evidence has little impact on policy. Now, I suspect that's quite a sweeping assessment. Might apply to areas like asylum policy or smuggling policy more than it does, say, to education policy. But maybe could you explain a little bit more about the kind of impact this kind of work might have on decision making? Does it lead to changes in policies and practices? Do we see stronger links between research evidence and action? And a third thing, which may be a bit more speculative, we do a lot of work on attitudes. We know that the social and political attitudes of people are formed relatively early in life and powerfully influenced by education. And we've seen, for instance, greater positivity, favorability to migration, which has been linked to access to education. And what you're pointing out is quite a dramatic effect of COVID on education, which might then, and as I say, it's speculative, have negative effects on the social and political attitudes of younger people because of maybe less exposure to effective education or less, or lower levels of educational attainment.
So, yeah, thank you for the question, Andrew. I mean, I rushed a little bit, but I think that one of the first questions he asked is, why these organizations and not the others? They've been the most active in terms of being prescriptive around educational policy sort of prescriptions, right? I think the interesting thing, though, and I didn't really get to it in my presentation, which, I think I should have spent more time on this, which is what's going on between, for instance, OECD's policy prescriptions and what UNESCO is doing, as an example. And so this is a paper that's under review with Paula and Don. And so what we found is when we looked at both those organizations, what you're seeing particularly with UNESCO is they're actually starting to draw more heavily on the OECD PISA data to make recommendations for those countries. The question that I have, and the question that we all need to think about, is how appropriate is that to use a measure that was designed for industrialized, globalized, global North countries to make policy prescriptions for students coming from Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, where, access to education is pretty important. And going back to that earlier point, I think when you look at the economics of educational literature, in the 60s, it was all about school completion. And the global North moved on from that into achievement. And the global South, Education for All, UNESCO, UNICEF are still focusing on completion rates themselves. So I know you asked many questions and I probably didn't answer half of what you asked. But I think what's interesting is this convergence between what these two very different international organizations have been promoting over the last 30 years, and you're starting to see a significant convergence in the key messages that are coming out and reliance on the same metrics. And that actually shows up right in their literature, right in their own literature.
Thank you. I was also interested more speculatively in whether you would anticipate any effects on the social and political attitudes of younger people as a consequence of this, the negative effects on educational experience, given that people's attitudes are very powerfully influenced by their early life experiences. Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be a little bit handcuffed because I'm usually working with large data sets. So, as an example, I looked at growth mindset, bullying, but probably the one that will intersect with what you're talking about is this idea of sense of belonging. I mean, if students don't feel connected to schools, they tend to not believe that education is a good uh, way to improve social mobility. And so that there are some individuals, I'm not one of them, that are looking at this issue around social mobility. I've done some research looking at, the impact of educational achievement across nationally, right? And so in terms of intergenerational social mobility, we do know that some countries significantly reward education at a much higher level than other countries. I have a paper that I published, and it was also picked up by the World Economic Forum that actually looked at this. We did a statistical analysis using PIAC data.
Okay, thank you. Marina Kieda. I'm Jean-Monnet Fellow here at TAUI, and I'm from Ukraine. And what was your methodic of choosing the countries for your research? Because I'm so sorry, I haven't seen Ukraine, and I'm interested very much. And the second question actually connected with the first one is the period, the period of your research. It is finished with 2022 year. Yes?
Yes, this,
Not 20,
this was 2022 results.
yes. Yes, it is interesting to trace the impact of war and this war migration wave onto these numbers, also statistics, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've had graduate students, for instance, I had a grad student look at the impact of civil war on educational outcomes. COVID is part of a larger sort of category looking at, emergency education, right? So natural disasters, famines, war. There's people that have done smaller scale studies looking at individual countries. So, I mean, the Ukraine context would be very interesting to study because of displacement and also, civil conflict. What we do know is students that come out of those regions, shouldn't surprise anyone, are more likely to be struggling with mental health issues. I didn't provide it in my presentation, but we do have data on mental health and physical health coming out of the pandemic. There was a deterioration in mental health outcomes in 60 to 70% of students. In terms of physical health, less than 5% of students during the pandemic were meeting daily physical activity recommended daily physical activity levels. So mental health and physical health were also impacted. But to your point, yeah, I'm absolutely certain people will be studying the impact of civil conflict and international conflict, like in Ukraine, and what that would be, what kind of impact that would have in terms of quantifying actually what students have lost in Ukraine.
Yeah, and Ukraine is also a part of PISA research, as far as I know, and it's interesting to compare results, for example, and this impact because Ukraine gave actually nearly, for this day, nearly 8 million, but it was nearly 8 million in 2023 at the beginning, and now it is 6 million of refugees in general and many children as well. And they are engaged in this European system of education. It's also an interesting point.
Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, we don't actually have a separate category for refugee students that are picked up by any of these measures. So whether it's PISA, whether it's the Trends in International Mathematics study, or the PEARLS Progress in any of the international measures aren't really picking up on refugee status. So going back to my earlier point, we don't capture circular migration that well. We don't capture refugee populations. I had a graduate student who specifically was looking at the impact on refugee students. And so when we think of immigrant students, we often refer to them as having a double disadvantage. One, they often come from lower SES. Two, they often have language difficulties if they're coming from a different language context. But refugee students have a triple disadvantage because they're also often dealing with post-traumatic stress related to conflict. So, I mean, there's going to be a large segment of the Ukrainian student population that is not just you're also dealing with all these sorts of mental health issues that are inescapable, really, given their circumstances.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Friedrich Pöschl, I'm a research fellow here. Could you tell us anything more about the factors that determine how much stronger the negative impact is on children of migrants? I'm not surprised overall that that they are worse affected, let's say. We see similar things in the labor market. When there's a crisis hitting the labor market, migrant workers are normally worse affected, and there's reasons for that. But in this case, it's not at all obvious, I would say. And there should be something in the data, like, say, language spoken at home, for example, if that makes a difference. Something like that.
Thank you for the question. So on the policy side, and this is really what the Routledge book that's going to be coming out is focused on. We're trying to understand and do an impact evaluation of the policies that were more or less successful in mitigating some of these negative impacts. So what you're asking is, okay, what kinds of policies might have actually helped? As an example, one of the key things we know of, well, there's two, but number one, a non-weighted funding formula, meaning the country puts the resources towards the student population that needs it most, as opposed to every single student, whether they're immigrant, non-immigrant, refugee, is getting allocated the same amount of funding. The school or the district or the system or the region is allocating the same amount of money. So obviously putting more money towards immigrant and refugee student populations, so they have more resources at play, will obviously have a significant impact in improving those educational outcomes. So as an example, often across countries, they know what their FTE ratio is. So what is the student to teacher ratio? And class sizes alone don't actually, it is not a good measure of educational achievement, more so at the younger ages than at the senior level grades, but it does have a significant impact for immigrant student populations. The other thing is catch-up policies, meaning policies that are geared primarily just at reading, math, and science actually won't help students catch up because they are too segmented, and there's often unintended negative consequences that come when policies are designed solely at, we've got to get their math up, their math scores up, their reading scores up, their science scores up. It often leads to a lot of negative things like teaching to the test, narrowing the curriculum, eliminating non-tested subject matter prior to a test, the sorts of things that students actually come to school for, right? Students don't always get up in the morning because they want to go to a math lesson. They might go because they have music, they have phys ed. So I think catch-up policies are something we need to avoid. The third thing, very quickly, is we do know that there were a lot of different policies that countries had out there to help during the pandemic. Tutoring seems to have had a pretty positive impact, but not tutoring across the board, tutoring services provided to those most at risk, right?
Can I follow up? Just to follow up for a second. So policies, yes, that's very interesting and very relevant, but also there's got to be more to find about who are the groups most at risk. So I would expect differences between countryside and cities, for example, because also in the case of the pandemic, in the countryside, kids could be outside much more and so on, and perhaps meet up. And so to understand sort of there's also a lot to learn from here for integration policy, perhaps more generally. What are the factors that sort of have to be covered for these children to be successful, let's say? So in terms of demographics, in terms of where they live, how they live, what the household looks like, what's in the household, what is not there, and so on and so on. Media consumption, you name
Yeah, I
it.
don't think I could answer that question in a minute. I definitely could answer the question, but I mean, there's a bunch of different factors. Like you just mentioned where they're from. Like almost everywhere around the world, rural kids underperform relative to urban and suburban children. But during the pandemic, those same students were also even more at risk because lack of connectivity issues, right? So, you know, there's very few exceptions to that rule. Like the Netherlands, as an example, is one of the few places around the world where students from the countryside tend to outperform students from urban settings. So immigrant students tend to be clustered in urban areas for sure. In terms of the factors, I mean, it's not just the supports that go to the child, but parental education programs are, which usually reside outside of K to 12 education systems or compulsory education systems, also tend to have a positive impact on immigrant student outcomes. Meaning, does the mother and father or the guardian, are they getting the supports they need to help their child? So you can, as you can imagine, when we moved online, in most industrialized societies, students were in front of a computer doing things. And obviously, I could tell you, being an immigrant myself, my father had a grade 6 education and my mother had a grade 2. Grew up during World War II. And, you know, so obviously when my kids were going through the pandemic, if they asked me a question, I could help them. But imagine another child whose parents don't know how to operate a computer, don't have those types of skills. So I think, you know, I can't give you just one factor. I think, you know, we've looked at literally dozens and dozens of variables, and it's a constant, and it's very dangerous actually to just try to find one factor. For instance, you know, like as an example, streaming tends to be negative for all students, but in particular for immigrant students. Streaming or tracking, what you refer to as tracking. But there are exceptions to the rule. Like Germany, as an example, has a highly tracked system, but they don't, in terms of student outcomes, it doesn't seem to impact them as much as, for instance, in North America or in other parts of Western Europe. So I think what's most important to think about is we have this constellation of factors, but no one collection manifests itself the same way within a country. If you told me the country, then I probably would remember, you know, 2 or 3 that seem to be quite salient. But, you know, early language enrichment, those sorts of programs tend to be beneficial for students. But it's more so than that.
Just as a quick point, if I understood correctly, you were saying that obviously the role of these international organizations is often based on data and evidence and experience of higher income countries. But were you also saying that that can then lead to policy recommendations flowing out from these organizations into contexts where they're not where they may well not be appropriate? Did I understood you correctly there?
Yeah, you did understand me correctly. It'll be interesting because one of the papers is under review with a journal that's run by that organization. I'm not going to name it. And I was quite critical of it because I thought, you know, and we think, my co-authors and I feel that I don't think using a measure like PISA to make policy prescriptions, and I've made this point already repeatedly, is appropriate in all contexts, you know. And I mean, there's people that would say that using PISA as any kind of cross-national achievement measure might be inappropriate. You know, the late Harvey Harvey Goldstein would have argued, you know, you shouldn't be using a measure to compare countries cross-nationally.
Right, thanks. Well, I think we've kind of run out of So I think we've run out of time. Many thanks to Louis for that very stimulating presentation. Some quite dramatic results there, really. It was it was kind of learned quite a lot from that, bigger effects than I imagined. And so it's very useful, very informative. So hopefully those in the room and those online have appreciated Louis' presentation. We can share the slides with the people who've registered for the event, so that and if you want, obviously, I'm sure Lou would be very happy if people wanted to engage in around some of the points he's made or some of the publications that are coming out from this work. So thank you, Louis. Thank you to everybody who joined us online.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for hosting me, Andrew.
Thanks.